go. Keep it coming. Push, 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 push. Push, Max. Let's go. 1, rest.
Hi, my name is Matt Shaw, and I'm the Senior Associate Athletic Director for Sports Performance at the University of Denver. Today I'm excited to discuss the application of the Glute Isometric Series to alter neuroplasticity of the glute musculature. I just want to acknowledge that a lot of what I'm presenting on today was initially something that was presented to me back in 2016 and 2017. Nicholas Ludhoma, chiropractor that here is locally, is also one of the co-educators behind FNOR, the Functional Neuro Orthopedic Rehabilitation Group, and this system of education was also developed by David George and Stuart Fife. In 2017, this information was presented as part of the Lumbo-Pelvic Hip Complex Education Seminar here in town in Denver, Colorado. With their permission, today I'm going to be presenting on one aspect of that education seminar, which was the Glute Isometric Series and its involvement in reducing low back pain and compensation of the Lumbo-Pelvic Hip Complex. The Glute Isometric Series that was initially presented as part of the FNOR education seminar really represented one of the most successful strategies that I've seen in reducing the incidence of low back pain or in improving motor control at the hip and in re-centralizing hip dominance with athletes. It's very common that you find athletes that are entering into your environments that already are presented with poor motor control and kinesthetic awareness related to the hip. Asymmetries that have been developed over prolonged exposure within sport, especially asymmetrical sports that involve sticks, throwing, swinging, or kicking, are very, very common, where athletes are constantly loading over one side predominantly and then lack the ability to load into the hip on the opposite side. Long term, a lot of the time that this can end up leading to low back compensation and a lot of the time symptoms within low back pain. Likewise, in gait patterns, you'll notice unilateral issues related to the stability of the pelvis and the lack of control of the glute med within gait. The structure of the Glute Isometric Series really was established via neuroplasticity research. Neuroplasticity is the flexible reorganization of the brain in response to its environment. So essentially, as athletes, the input that we experience through activity or through exercise can create a meaningful change to the level of the brain in terms of the strategies that we present and how we move. But also we need to take into account that the absence of input can also create a large alteration in movement quality. Research on neuroplasticity is really founded within stroke survivors and within animal trials, but the key is that all of these studies, the similarity is that high volume, repetition, and frequency are the key foundations behind making meaningful change to the level of the brain. Within these studies, the volumes presented were around 300 to 600 reps daily and across a 6 to 7 day period of time. And these changes in the primary motor cortex and glute max activation were observed within that 1 week of isometric exposure. Intervention of the Glute Isometric Series follows suit of the research behind neuroplasticity. An 11 to 15 minute period is designated for the athletes to begin training and to start initiation of glute isometrics and finishing the final few minutes in cross crawl patterns or gait related repetitive positions that are similar to that of running in cyclical formats. Across a 10 to 14 day exposure range, the athletes perform this at the beginning of every single workout and then will go through more training following suit. The isolated exercises are each individually picked based on glute involvement within hip abduction, hip extension, and hip external rotation patterns. There's a variety of patterns that also involve both short and long tissue lengths in each of those positions. This allows an increased complexity between different strategic variations and allows the brain to truly map out glute dominance in every position that it may see within sport. Likewise, the first half of the exposures are purely isometric, where the athlete only performs isometric variations, but then in the final or the back half, whether it's 5 or whether it's 7 days of exposure, it becomes isodynamic. There's an alternating 2-second period where the athlete will hold 2 seconds at end range, transition dynamically to mid range, and then hold an additional 2 seconds repetitively across the 1 minute duration. The lumbopelvic positioning of the athlete is very critical as it creates a neutral cylinder between the pelvis and the rib cage. So coaching the athlete on an individual level to eliminate any level of compensation and low back extension, or cueing down regulation of paraspinals through better mechanical positioning, and also the elimination of QL quads or conscious hamstring contraction, can drastically improve the ability of the athlete to strategically load directly into the glute without external compensation above or below the joint line. In the practical experience of being in the college environment, we get a vast array of individuals and symptoms. Many individuals come in asymptomatic with low compensation, where we feel that we can immediately move them towards a level of intensity and resistance that allows them to load using a miniband. However, there's also alternative situations where you might be working with a symptomatic individual or somebody who's asymptomatic but has a high degree of compensation. In those two situations, altering the load, instead of using a miniband, using only purely body weight variations, or making sure that the individual athlete has full control over their joint position without compensation, are key. So down regulating intensity and meeting the athletes where they're individually at relative to their ability to decrease compensation is the key within coaching. We found the timing of application of the Glute Isometric Series to be most effective in 3 different periods of time across an annual cycle with an athlete. The early off-season reconditioning period, so coming at the conclusion of their rest and moving right into the first 1 to 2 weeks of training, is the initiation of glute isometrics and then beginning general physical preparation for off-season training. The second is in-season maintenance, especially working with athletes that might be in season for 6 months or longer. Using in-season maintenance periods allows an athlete to touch up upon the Glute Isometric Series, sometimes done with less total volume and repetition, but still being able to consistently touch this within a 2 to 3 week period and help to decrease the likelihood of compensation and low back pain across the entirety of their in-season period. The third period of time and application would be in situations of reconditioning post-surgery or working with athletes in return to play cases. We found a really valuable period of time where an athlete begins return to training post-rehab, and being able to isolate, especially in situations such as an ACL, do isolated glute work across a period of time and resetting any type of compensation at the hip, especially when an athlete has been immobilized in situations of using a cast or a boot, and where gait and hip related compensation is very common. This would be a visual display of the daily structure of the Glute Iso series. Within a training session, the athletes would start with the initial period of time of running long duration isometrics using either a band or running body weight variations off of each of the exercises. The athletes would perform each variation on their left and right sides and then progress to the next exercise. Notice that there's different strategic variations between hip abduction, external rotation, or hip extension, and then a varying ability of putting also the muscle at different short or long muscle lengths. As the athletes complete the isometric variations, they then progress into the application of dynamic gait patterns. This is, at times, can be optional depending on the type of training that follows these sessions, but I found value in teaching athletes a regressed variation of gait, such as sagittal cross-crawl patterning or frontal plane cross-crawl patterning, right at the conclusion of their ISO series. Finally, moving them into normalized general physical prep, or if they're in season, their normal training, would then be the rest of the workout. The initial side of the isometric series primes their brain and their tissue to move into hip and glute dominance, and then it's the same thing that would get reinforced on the remainder of the session within their normalized training, is to maintain hip dominance in the glute drive behind every exercise that they're performing. Especially early in general physical prep, in the early off-season period, we also include things such as foundational jumping with bilateral and unilateral variations, and using high rep, low load training sessions, which are very much based on muscle endurance, or time under tension using isometrics, or body weight control, and making sure that there's a three-dimensional emphasis on how they utilize their hip in every plane of motion. In front of you is a visual display of each of the positions involved in the first half of the Glute Iso series. Each of these are static isometrics throughout each of the positions of external rotation, abduction, and hip extension. The first exercise is the sideline clamshell, where the band is located above the knee line. The athlete is positioned entirely on their side with a neutral spine position and performs an end range isometric for 1 minute. Second exercise is the hip abduction. We cue the athlete in this position to roll the pelvis into a neutral hip position relative to the orientation of the rib cage, engage the front side core, and then abduct to an end range just shy of where they would hip hike at the level of their pelvis. The third position is a bilateral glute bridge, extending at the hip and slightly abducted against the band. The third is a bilateral bridge with an external bias. Notice that the feet in this position are farther extended away from the body to extend the hip and put the tissue length into a shorter range of motion on the glute. The fifth movement is a quadruped clam or external rotation shell, where the hip is located just shy of a 90-degree angle and externally rotated into one side. Then the one after that is the side-to-side mini-band rock out of an athletic stance, where the athlete transitions to a single leg stance, stabilizing the opposite hip and knee, and then shifts back and forth across the minute, maintaining an isometric position on their body position. The last ISO is a cross under lunge, where the athlete positions themselves into an acceleration angle with a slight internal bias at the hip, with the back leg crossing under midline. In this position, it's important to note that the athlete's chest should be located over the ball of the foot, and that they should be entirely focused on pressing down through the lead leg and engaging their glute in a relative position that would be standing and in performance. The ISO series, complexity of movement is progressed. In the first movement, the athlete is oriented in a sideline clam position. As they drive to end range, they begin isodynamics. 2 seconds at their maximal end range shy of where the hip rotates, and then 2 seconds at mid-range. The second movement is hip abduction. Notice that we cue the athlete to make sure that they're preventing any level of hip hike while maintaining extension of the hip into a neutral position underneath the rib cage. As they extend up, there's no change to the level of their pelvis. In the bilateral glute bridge position, the isodynamics occur in abduction, 2 seconds at max end range of abduction, and then 2 seconds in the neutral position, maintaining hip extension. In the fourth position, the bridge with external bias, the athletes slide their feet away from the hip, 2 seconds at maximum end range of external rotation, and then they allow the knees into mid-range external while bridging the hip just barely off the ground. In the quadruped position, the athlete stabilizes at their core and then only performs external rotation on one side, and then after the 2 second hold, returns to a more neutral or midline position underneath, maintaining the stability of the band. In the athletic stance lateral rock, the athlete now moves to the ball of the foot, where we engage more of the calf musculature with the hip. They have to zigzag from a high to a low athletic stance. Notice that there's variation now in the depth of the hip, creating more variation across their range of motion while they're still performing an isometric position with the band and the joint placement of external rotation. The cross under lunge also shifts to the ball of the foot and engaging the big toe, and the variation shifts to an up and down motion engaging the glute to extend at the hip, but no change in the spine position as the athlete varies up and down across each 2 second period. Not demonstrated in the isometric positions, the cross crawl patterns also shift to a ball of foot and visually demonstrate that the athlete goes through a repetitive gait position in the sagittal plane. The athlete loads into the bottom position on one side and then crosses into an extended position on the opposite. The last one is a frontal plane cross crawl pattern where the athlete loads into the bottom position on one side and then extends into hip flexion on the opposite, using both glutes in a repetitive action. Big key takeaways over the last 8 years of implementation is that we really have completely reduced the incidence of low back pain in a population, especially within hockey, where it can become a chronic problem at almost any level. We've seen athletes within the first 5 days of exposure drastically improve glute activation and the reduction of compensation at their low back. One thing as a coach that's a powerful tool is physically using your hands to get the athletes to either place their, especially on a bridge position, place their hands on their paraspinals, or to actually physically feel the engagement of their low back, and then teaching them the repositioning of their pelvis in posterior tilt to eliminate any type of low back extension in different static positions. If the athlete, especially in a sideline position, can't reach back without compensating, then a coach can come by and check low back extension in that position and see if they can down regulate that tension locally. It's a massive tool kinesthetically. Athletes constantly are communicating that they feel like they have a powerful awareness of loading into their hip in other exercises and as they progress into normalized training. Whether it's in bottom end range where they no longer feel loading into adductor magnus, or in different lines of tension in their hamstring or quad, they can truly feel loading occur in their hip where it should be placed. Really, we've implemented this consistently every off season in the first 2 weeks of exposure as they progress back into training. So really within the college environment, which can be difficult in terms of time and exposure, the first week we usually on average get 4 exposures of the Glute Iso series, and then the second week we get an additional 4, and sometimes we're able to take that into a 2.5 week period and really truly get that 10-day exposure period as they progress back into normalized training. We keep grooving these patterns in different contexts. So just because the Glute Iso series usually for us concludes within a 10-day period or 10 exposures, we're constantly doing hip abduction, hip extension, and external rotation work in different contexts, whether it's plyometric, speed training, or positions that we're doing isometric training in. We've really gone into using 3-dimensional straps and using that to create, especially and teach athletes, hip coil and loading at the hip in rotational based patterning. We're using med balls to create loading at the hip and then teaching them to drive using their lower body out of positions. The reintroductions in season for us really are constituted by bye weeks or following travel or different types of like break periods within the season, such as holiday breaks. We found success in decreasing the total time into the Glute Iso series and just doing reintroductions at 30 seconds in each variation, but making it more consistent every 3 to 4 weeks. Coming off of travel, where the athletes have prolonged exposure of hip flexion or in bad positioning related to travel circumstances, we found value in the athletes just making sure that we get back into posterior work, such as the Glute Iso series, and making them aware of how they load into each hip individually. I think there's massive implications regarding athlete return to play and function. We've seen, especially in circumstances such as ACLs, the minute that we can begin doing isolated work on the ground or in a standing position using a mini band, we'll begin training the hip girdle and making sure that we reinstitute any level of glute isometrics to get them back into hip dominance and glute function. And we've seen a massive return and improvement as they get back into more normalized training as part of the return to play process, and a reduction in any level of compensation at the hip above or below that joint line. I hope that you enjoy the presentation today. If you have questions, please feel free to reach directly out to me via email. My email is matthew.shaw@du.edu or on Instagram, Shaw_sportsperformance. I'm happy to answer any practical questions or context-derived questions regarding this. And I've also attached the works cited related to a lot of the research behind neuroplasticity. Thank you.
Go, 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 go. Keep it coming. Push, 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 push. Push, Max. Let's go. 1, rest.